Voyeurism. Teenagers walking around. A scared shitless Bond villain. The director of Dennis the Menace going berserk. And William Shatner. All that and more on the debut episode of Splatterdrome. Hello and welcome to Splatterdrome, the horror and sci-fi movie review show that always forgets its chemistry book. I'm your host, Brandon Moeller. Thank you so much for joining me. On this very first episode of the show, I'm going to be talking about Halloween, John Carpenter's 1978 low-budget triumph that spawned an entire decade's worth of imitators throughout the 1980s. I chose this film not just because it's a bona fide classic and one of my personal favorites, but for more contemporaneous reasons. As of this recording, we are less than 2 months away from the release of Halloween 2018. Now, I've already released a podcast discussing the trailer for the new film, my expectations for it, my anxieties about it, so I won't go too much into that here. But suffice it to say that Halloween 2018 is easily my most anticipated film of the year. We've got Jamie Lee Curtis coming back, John Carpenter returns for the first time since Halloween 3 in the early 80s. He's an executive producer and also wrote new music for the soundtrack. Also, Nick Castle, the man who played Michael in the very first film, has returned as well. These are all reasons to be very excited for the film. It is being produced by Blumhouse. They've given us some good stuff, they've also given us a lot of shit. So I don't really know what to expect, but I'm choosing to be optimistic, which is not that common for me. But there will be plenty of time to get into all that once the new film is actually released. So, for now, let's get into today's topic, which is the very first Halloween.
The one, the only, the classic Halloween.
So let's get into some specifics about Halloween in a segment I call Plus Minus. So let's start with some good news. John Carpenter's camera work. One of the defining features of Halloween is Carpenter's slow, plodding POV shots. He uses them throughout the film, and I find them extremely effective. People talk about the tracking shot in Goodfellas, as well they should. But how about Carpenter's Panaglide shot to open Halloween? Here we watch young Michael as he goes from the front of his house to the back, through the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, up a flight of stairs, no cuts. That is all one shot with a single camera operator walking through the scene. In the Blu-ray commentary, Carpenter talks at length about the Panaglide camera, which is a camera unit carried by a single operator. Carpenter talks about how you can feel the steps of the camera operator, and it makes those POV shots feel much more authentic than, say, a tracking shot would, which is just gliding along on a track without any bumps in the road. Carpenter uses these kinds of shots to great effect throughout the film, and not just with Michael. When Laurie and Annie are walking home from school, and Laurie spies Michael peeking out from behind the hedge, that's another one of those same POV shots. Near the end of the film, when Laurie is walking across the street to the other house, fearing that something is wrong, it's that same kind of shot. And those slow POV shots in this setting, which is supposed to be suburban Illinois, are extremely effective, and it's part of what makes this movie so scary. I lived in suburban Illinois for 2 years, and the neighborhood around one of the places I lived could easily have been Haddonfield. It was the same aesthetic, nice houses on tree-lined streets, very quiet. You would never expect something so ghastly to happen in a setting like that. Carpenter makes you feel like you're just walking through a quiet, safe neighborhood, and you're slowly absorbed into it, even though you know that something terrible is on the horizon. Another part of Carpenter's camera work is his choice of wide anamorphic shots. And by choosing to shoot almost exclusively anamorphic, he's able to capture wide panoramas, like the shot of Loomis in the phone booth, or some of these shots of the girls walking where you get the whole scope of the neighborhood. But also, Carpenter is able to capture very intimate shots, like when Laurie is in the closet fighting off Michael, or when Loomis and the nurse are in the car driving to Smith's Grove. A director who is less skilled at framing shots would not have succeeded with the budget that Carpenter had for this film. And you can tell when someone has a real eye for it, like Carpenter, or when it's just someone imitating Carpenter, which we'll see with the next film. The next plus, Michael Myers as a force of nature. Throughout the film, Michael is referred to as Michael many times. But if you look, he's credited as the Shape. Now, the movie makes it clear several times that though Michael may physically be a man, he is something more. He is something more dangerous. Loomis is convinced of it, and he'll tell it to anyone who will listen.
He's gone. He's gone from here. The evil is gone.
Man wouldn't do that. This isn't a man.
I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Calling him the Shape is just one of the ways that Carpenter is telling us that Michael may be a flesh and blood person, but he's really representing something bigger. Now, he shows us this in a couple of ways. Firstly, Loomis says that Michael hasn't spoken a word in nearly 15 years. Communication is one of the most basic tenets of any living creature, human or not. And the idea that Michael doesn't reach out towards anyone else in the most basic of ways, that's a red flag. Also, Michael's mask. It looks like something that a person with only the most basic understanding of the human form would create. It has all the features of a human being: mouth, nose, eyes, ears, hair. But there's something about it that looks almost alien. Think about it like the Terminator. We understand that it's only an imitation of the human form, and that underneath lies something we don't fully understand. I think one of the clearest examples is near the end of the film when Michael's coming after Laurie. He slips into the house through an open window, but we never see just how open that window is. We see a curtain fluttering in the breeze, but there are no sounds or signs of entry. But all of a sudden Michael is in the room. Now, I've always taken that to mean that he's able to move in spaces that a human being couldn't, in a more stealthy way, like he's just some kind of spirit that can slip in with the breeze. Of course, his ability to survive multiple stabbings, and being shot, and falling out a window, these all tell us that there's something going on besides just the basic anatomy of a human being. When you take all those things together, it's very clear that Michael is more than just a normal man, and that makes him much more frightening than your average slasher killer. The next plus is the score. John Carpenter wrote and recorded all the music in this movie himself. It starts off the movie with the title card and the zoom in on the pumpkin. The next section slowly unsettles you as the girls are walking around Haddonfield. The music is letting you know that this tranquil suburban setting is not what it appears, that there's something happening here that is going to shock you. People that haven't even seen these movies recognize the opening theme of Halloween. Carpenter screened the film a few times without any music, and people told him it wasn't scary. So the impact of his score is obvious. The next plus: paranoia versus reality. I watched Halloween in preparation for this review, and something occurred to me for the first time. And that is, how many of Laurie's Michael sightings are real, and how many of them are just paranoia? Laurie notices Michael watching her several times. The first is outside her classroom, when Michael is parked across the street. The next is when he peeks out from behind a hedge. And a third time when Laurie gets home, looks out her bedroom window, and there's Michael by the laundry line. So how many of these sightings are real? I would point to the third as being a false vision, and here's why. When we look at the shot, Laurie looks out the window, sees Michael, there's a quick cut back to Laurie, and then a quick cut back to the clothing line, and Michael's gone. Now, Laurie never looks away during this time. So how would, in a split second, Michael just disappear? I guess we could go back to the idea of Michael as a force. If he can slip in through a crack in a window without making any noise, perhaps he could just disappear in a poof of smoke in a split second. I don't think Carpenter is going that supernatural with Michael. So that tells me that this third sighting is just Laurie's mind playing tricks on her, after actually seeing Michael a couple of times, and it spooked her pretty bad. I think this adds an extra element to the film, because we know that there's a character named Michael, we know he has killed and wants to kill again, but just because he's wandering around Haddonfield doesn't mean that every sighting of him is real. Consider that Haddonfield is a town that is still haunted by the murder of Judith Myers in the early 60s. When the bulk of the movie takes place, we're 15 years after the fact, and yet the Myers house is still empty, it's in disrepair, no one wants to buy it.
Every kid in Haddonfield thinks this place is haunted. They may be right.
Think about a real-life example of this. 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, where the DeFeo murders took place. That's prime real estate. That house was bought and bought and bought again, unlike the Myers house, which has stood empty in what appears to be an affluent white Illinois suburb. That is also prime real estate. Although the movie doesn't say it, it's probably fair to guess that there's some kind of a mass repression going on in Haddonfield about this horrible crime that took place 15 years earlier. Think about A Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy Krueger is murdered by parents many years before the events of the first film, and the memory of that has been repressed by almost everyone in that town. So when kids start to talk about a man in a striped sweater and a fedora with long knife fingers attacking them in their dreams, no one wants to believe it. Nobody wants to acknowledge that Fred Krueger ever existed. And this is perhaps why in Haddonfield, when Dr. Loomis shows up and talks to the sheriff and says, he's coming, be ready, he doesn't want to believe it. And this is another way that the impact of Michael Myers extends far beyond his physical body. So obviously I've praised the film quite a bit, but let's talk about some negative aspects. The first minus, Michael driving? Early in the film, Michael escapes the Smiths Grove Sanitarium, steals a car, and drives out of sight. But how? According to Dr. Loomis, Michael has been locked away since the age of 6, which is way too young for anyone to have taught him how to operate a vehicle. I think Carpenter and Deborah Hill, as they were writing the script, realized this was going to be a problem. So they did include a little throwaway line from Dr. Loomis.
Now, for God's sakes, he can't drive a car. He was doing very well last night. Maybe someone around here gave him lessons.
And that's the only explanation we ever get. Admittedly, it's a very minor complaint. It does not affect my overall view of the movie. But the more times I watch it, the more that sticks out to me as a problem that should have been addressed in a more comprehensive way. The next minus. Totally. Let's talk a little bit about PJ Soles, who I guess you could consider a B-level scream queen because she also had a role in Carrie. Here in Halloween, though, I can't stand her. Her dialogue is horrible.
So who cares? I always forget my chemistry book and my math book and my English book and my French book. And, well, who needs books anyway? I don't need books. I always forget all of my books. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you have your books or not.
She does have a couple of entertaining lines, but her overuse of totally really bothers me.
Hey, I'll be totally wiped out.
I don't think you have enough to do tomorrow.
Totally. You totally never show. I've been totally charted. Totally.
She's exactly the kind of cliche, ditzy, blonde, sex-crazed teenage character that I wouldn't expect Carpenter to include in one of his movies. I understand Linda's place in this movie. She's the polar opposite of the chaste, virginal, quiet Laurie. And then Annie fits right in there in the middle. She's headstrong and a little more observant than Linda, and not quite as sex-crazed and giddy. PJ Soles and the character of Linda do have a place in this movie, but I can't stand them. They grate on me every time I watch Halloween. Major minus. And finally, mundane activities. Let me repeat that I love this movie. The slow build does not bother me at all. But this movie is a lot of people doing mundane things. Walking home from school, driving around the neighborhood, talking on the phone. There are even scenes of kids sitting and watching another movie. Overall, it doesn't bother me, but there have been times where I've tried to watch the movie and just haven't gotten into it on that particular day, because a lot of it is just slow building. 9 out of 10 times, I'm fine with it. But there will be audience members who need stuff to happen more quickly. The first kill in this movie doesn't even take place until almost an hour in. And for some people, that kind of pacing in a horror film might not work. Before I sign off here, I want to answer a few questions from my Instagram followers. Dr. Glock asks, what is it, in your opinion, that works so well for this film that it still holds up to this very day? I think the answer is simplicity. Although Halloween is about a psychopath murdering teenagers, filmmaking-wise, it's relatively subtle. I talked about John Carpenter's camera techniques, and I think those go a long way. They're simple but effective, and that makes them timeless. Generations from now, audiences will be looking at Halloween the same way that we look at Hitchcock films today. There are, of course, elements that will date these things, technology, wardrobe, slang, but for the most part, the filmmaking shines through, and it's something that audiences will always connect with. Carpenter's films, in general, aren't overly stylized, and that goes a long way in helping Halloween and his entire body of work feel modern and stand up to audiences of all generations. The next question is from Jenga Dance, who asks, what was the concept behind the design of Michael's mask? Well, you may be surprised to learn that there was no grand design for this now famous mask. Being a low-budget production, Carpenter's team went to a store, bought some Halloween masks, and then tried to see if they could make something scary out of them. The Michael Myers mask from this first film is actually a modified Captain Kirk Star Trek mask. As you can see from this comparison, the resemblance is clear. What Carpenter's team did was remove the eyebrows and the sideburns and paint it white. Carpenter's inspiration was a French horror film from 1960 called Eyes Without a Face. You can see what he was going for. Many thanks to those of you that sent in questions. We're about at the end of the review here, so I want to give out a couple of awards. First off, Best Kill. That's pretty easy for this film. Most of these kills are bloodless and not that interesting. The exception being Linda's boyfriend, Bob, who was attacked in the kitchen, stabbed to a wall, and then observed as if he's an abstract piece of art. One of the best scenes in the film. I also want to give out an Unsung Hero Award, and that goes to cinematographer Dean Cundy. The lighting in this film is superb. This shot in particular, where Michael materializes out of a dark doorway to attack Laurie. When I talk about simplicity and masterful filmmaking techniques being what makes Halloween great, this is exactly the kind of thing I mean. So after all that, where do I land on Halloween 1978? Easy. 5 stars out of 5. It's a fantastic film. It's a horror masterpiece. It's one of my favorite flicks of all time. If you haven't seen it, I don't know what you're waiting for. I want to thank you for joining me for this first episode of Splatterdrome. I'll be back soon talking about Halloween 2.